this session, which is the first session of 2024. Happy New Year. Before I introduce Michael Ruse, number of housekeeping announcements. We'll start recording in a minute. Just a reminder about the mics and the visuals. You can turn them on if you're called to ask a question, but otherwise it helps to reduce the strain on the system if you turn it off. I'll do so myself when Michael starts speaking. The other thing is, if you want to raise a question, there's two ways of doing it. One is to raise the hand. You see the hand symbol at the middle of the top. You just press that and that will put you in a queue to ask a question, preferably after the talk. You can also put questions during the talk in the chat. If there's anything really you want to intervene quickly over, put it in the chat. I'll try and keep that monitored. Okay, that's the kind of housekeeping issues. So Brian, could you please turn the recording on?
Done.
Great, thank you, Brian. Thank you everyone for turning up to this session. It's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Ruse, who for most of you, if not all of you, will need little introduction because he's a leading philosopher of biology. British born, but living in the US, and has published a number of major works and articles on this topic. And he's chosen a fascinating and very important theme for this talk about the so-called new biology. We've all heard about this, but we wonder really what it's about. Michael's going to tell us. So welcome, Michael. It's great to have you with us. Please start.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed. There's a little bit of background to this. I obviously knew about the new biology, but I can't say that it was something which, fascinated me in any way. And then, 6 or 7 years ago, I was approached by somebody who said that they've got a very large Templeton grant. Was I interested in collaborating or writing a book? And if I was, there'd be $50,000 for me. Well, yeah, I sold my soul to the devil, and I took my money, and then I wrote there were two of us. The other person was Michael Ruse, who's a science educator. He was in the news a year or two back because he used to work for the Royal Society, and they fired him because they said he was a creationist, which is just not true. Anyway, we were doing it together, so of course it took me about 6 months to do my half, and then I waited 5 years before I could get anything out of him. And then when he sent something in, it had nothing to do with what I'd written. And we'd got a contract with Harvard, and I sincerely thought that when the referees' reports come in, that will be it. We could go our separate ways. Well, the referees' reports were as bad as I thought they would be, but we had an editor who wouldn't give up, made us do about 3 drafts, and finally the book was finished. And in a way, I'm very glad, because I think what we did produce is something worthwhile. One thing which we did do in the course of it is I'm a pretty keen Darwinian, so you can imagine I wasn't entirely friendly to all these people who kept, Evo, Devo, all of these things, internal, whatever. And so I was pretty critical about the new biology. Well, in the end, we were bashed into writing something a lot more balanced, as it were, in the sense of saying we're at a point where it'd be very useful, rather than to have polemics, to have people try to lay out what's going on. And so that's what this book is about. It's very much laying out what's going on. So there we are. I won't conceal that my own feelings are very much on the Darwinian side when it comes to the science, but when it comes to more philosophical issues, as you'll see as we go along, I'm a little more torn. Anyway, so there we are. So this is about the new biology. First slide, please. And have you got it up? Brian? Have you? Oh, thank you. So it's about the new biology, and this is the cover of the book, which came out about 6 months ago. and I saw Marion had got a copy of it. So anyhow, and this is, it's about, I don't know, it's about 300 pages. And as I say, it's written by me, Michael Ruse, and by Michael Rees, who is a professor of science education at University College London. He's also an Anglican minister. And his last book had a blurb from the Archbishop of Canterbury. This book does not. So anyhow, let me talk about what's going on here. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay, what I see the basis as, and I, I don't think I'm going out on a track that others wouldn't go, although they might not express it quite the way I do. I see that since the beginning of biology, back at the time of the Greeks, and the chaps you can see in that picture, on the left-hand side is Plato, and on the right-hand side is his student Aristotle. Uh, if you go back to them, then what was what linguists call the root metaphor? Uh, what one might call it the paradigm. What was the sort of conceptual set within which one looked at things? And for the Greeks, particularly for Plato, as he argues in the Theaetetus, and Aristotle too, it's very much to see the world as an organism, and you try to explain things, therefore, in organic terms. I mean, it's not a stupid thing that they would do this. Don't forget, we're at the time when we don't have electric lights and that sort of thing, and the sun goes down, and then you're in the dark, and you're living very much close to the seasons, and so you get spring, and then you get adulthood, summer, then, as it were, getting old, fall, and then on to death, winter, and then starts again. So the idea that things should be looked at organically is, as I say, far from being stupid, makes a great deal of sense. And this was the root metaphor which ruled right through the medieval times, right up to the time of the scientific revolution. So if you look at people like Augustine, and particularly Aquinas, you'll see that they owe a great deal to Plato and Aristotle, and the way that they think of the world is, as it were, in some sort of organic sense. Now, apart from anything else, notice what an organism does. What's interesting about an organism, let's say you've got an acorn or something like that, then what happens? You put it in the ground, you water it, and then it grows. You don't have to do things, as it were, to make it do what's going to do. It just develops and develops and develops, as it were, from internal forces rather than from being changed outside. I'm not saying it can't be changed outside, but generally an acorn grows into an oak. It doesn't grow into an elm tree. And more than that, what you get, it seems, is a kind of progression. You start with a humble acorn, and then you end with a magnificent oak. And so, as it were, it's progress. And of course, immediately people thought of this in human terms, and the favorite phrase was monad to man. In other words, blob all the way up to humans. And of course, that fit in very nicely with the Christian picture of God creating in 6 days, and we're the triumph, as it were, the apotheosis of the whole creative thing, but at the end of the 6th day. So, as I say, it fit in very nicely with Christianity.
If you're electing one president, but if you have a large group that you're selecting,
Michael, please switch off your microphone.
some of the crowd.
Not you, Professor Roos. I mean, our latest joiner. Michael Person, please switch off your microphone. Please proceed, Professor.
Can I keep going?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, just to remind everyone that all microphones be off, please, except for Michael, the speaker. Thank you.
Okay, so let's keep going. So we come to the scientific revolution, 16th, 17th century, sort of Copernicus to Newton, sort of very tightly. And the root metaphor changes from being an organism to being a machine, because what's happening now is that people are, for instance, developing very sophisticated clocks, like the fancy clock in Strasbourg Cathedral. And of course, there's the one that we've got in Wells, for instance, where you go and things go round and round, and all of those sorts of things. And other machines, particularly machines for pumping water and those things. So by the time we get to the 16th and into the 17th century, people are working with machines, and they're starting to think now in terms of a root metaphor as the machine, or if you, as I say, if you like, want to use the word paradigm, I'm comfortable with that. And so when you're going to try and understand things, you're not going to try to understand them in organic terms. You're going to try to understand them in, as I say, in machine terms. Next, please. Next slide. Thank you. And a great number of mechanists, probably the one I'm not showing you is Descartes. He's the sort of philosopher of mechanism, his discourse on method. But we know that on the one hand, on the left-hand side, we've got Newton, who's, of course, is a mechanist. If you look at his whole theory, basically what he's showing is how the Copernican system just keeps going. It goes round and round and round, but notice, there's no, in itself, there's no point to it. It doesn't have any value. It's just going round and round and round and round. It doesn't mean to say we can't give it value. We could say, oh, well, this was designed by God to make habitable for humans. But that's not part of the science. The science is it goes round and round.
Michael, please, may I interrupt you? Ulrika, can you switch off your camera, please?
Yes, I'll have to see what's going on here.
Yeah, and your microphone, please.
Please proceed, Michael.
Are we okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. On the right-hand side is Robert Boyle, of course, of Boyle's law that we know. But Boyle also was a pretty sophisticated philosopher come theologian who wrote on these things at the end of the 17th century. And Boyle was particularly interested in organisms. It's all very well to say planets are a machine, but organisms don't just seem to be machine-like. They do seem to have value. They do seem to have the purpose that, as I say, monad to man and those sorts of things. So the big worry was, how do you explain organisms in mechanical terms? And the trick that Boyle played was to say, when we're doing science, we're just looking at the machine thing. So if you're looking at humans, we're just working out how the heart pumps. In other words, all we're interested in is what makes the heart go bump, 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 bump. We're not asking about why it's doing that or anything like that. We're just looking at it as though it were a machine. However, we do know that the heart does have a purpose. It beats in order to circulate the blood, in order that we can live, or animals can live, and go about their business. So there is value. So Boyle's trick was to say, when we're talking about values, or what Aristotle called final causes, we're into religion now. We're not doing science anymore. So in other words, looking at organisms, on the one hand, we're going to regard them as machines. But on the other hand, we're going to regard them as things designed and given to us by God. So we've got the sort of two sides. And this takes us into the 18th century. And of course, at least with this, you can go on doing a lot of science. You can do a lot of biological science, but that's the thing. Next, please. Now, as far as the English were concerned, Boyle's solution was a very happy solution. Because, as you'll know, English Protestantism is a weird thing. We're not, as it were, Protestants, because like Luther, we couldn't stand the Catholic Church as such, or we wanted to be something sola scriptura rather than other things like that. We're Protestant because Henry VIII wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, and the Pope wouldn't let him. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish, which was more powerful. So Henry said, "Oh, bugger this," and he picked up and took his country, took his religion home. And so this is when we start with the Protestant religion in England, but it's not a Protestant religion based on a lot of theology. So at the end, towards the end of the 16th and into the 17th century, there was more and more attempt, as it were, to give the Anglican Protestantism some kind of firm base. And the way they did this was because England was very much getting into the industrial world and that sort of thing. Their theology became what is known as natural theology, as opposed to revealed theology. Revealed theology is the theology of faith. I know in my heart that my Saviour liveth. And of course, that's very much the theology that somebody like Luther is into. Whereas natural theology is very much, let's prove the existence of God. That everything is designed like, the eye is like a telescope. Telescopes have telescope makers. Therefore, the eye has an eye maker, the great optician in the sky. And the person who, as it were, kept developing this, puts it all in his textbooks, is the chap on the right, Archdeacon Paley. And he's the guy who says, if I'm crossing a heath and I bash my foot against a stone, so big deal. But if I bash my foot against a watch, then I know something's going on there, because watches don't just exist. They have to have designers. So, in other words, Boyle's position, although it was, as it were, fractured, it didn't explain organisms entirely in scientific terms, was, for the English particularly, a very comfortable sort of, what should I say, solution. Now, the person on the left is, of course, the greatest philosopher of modern times, Immanuel Kant, who was, in fact, a German. He lived in what was East Prussia then, is now part of Russia, in Königsberg. And Kant was a committed Newtonian. Kant became absolutely convinced that the world is a machine, that's how it worked. But Kant was also aware that organisms don't seem to fit into this, because they seem to have design and purpose and that sort of thing. However, Kant was brought up as a pietist, and pietists are kind of ultra-Lutherans in the sense that they really will not tolerate natural theology. For them, oh, Christ. Lizzie! Sorry. Lizzie!
I'm sorry.
Okay. So, I'm in the bedroom and on the bed, so I stay away from the dogs, but it doesn't always work, as you could tell. Anyhow, to go back to Kant. So Kant believed in God, but he was very much against natural theology, proving God through reason. If you're going to believe in God, you believe in God because of faith rather than because of reason. So Kant couldn't take the Paley position, namely that half of the understanding is done in terms of machines, the other half is done in terms organically, but that's part of religion. That was not acceptable for Kant. The only science that Kant could accept was machines. So what does he do about organisms? He says, well, we obviously have to think in final causes, teleological purposes, but that's not part of science. That's just a regulative principle, he called it, which we need because we're not that good at doing things. And what Kant then said, rather sneeringly, there will never be a Newton of the blade of grass. In other words, what he was saying was that biology will always be second rate because it cannot just explain everything just in terms of laws and machines. It has to have regulative principles, not part of science, but as it were, guiding it in some way. There will never be a Newton of the blade of grass. And next, please. One young man who knew a great deal about this is the chap on the right-hand side when he was young, and that, of course, is Charles Darwin. And Darwin grew up in England. He went to the University of Cambridge and became an absolutely committed Newtonian. That's the way he thought about the world. The world has to be thought in terms of machines. That it's laws, laws, laws all the way. However, Darwin was also aware that the problem of organisms, and do we explain them in terms of religion? No, Darwin was not at this point particularly non-religious, but he was certainly empathetic to what Kant was saying, because in fact one of Darwin's big mentors was a man called William Whewell, spelled Whewell, and Whewell was a philosopher at Cambridge. He wrote a history and philosophy of science books, and Whewell was a very ardent Kantian. So Darwin would have known that organisms are a problem. Yes, you can flip it into religion, but it's better if you don't. It's not that they didn't have religion. Whewell certainly believed in the existence of God. He thought that the world showed evidence of God, but that's not the point. How do you explain? And Darwin, I think, set out very deliberately to be the Newton of the blade of grass. And of course, the way that Darwin did this was through natural selection, which explains adaptation, which explains why we have the eye and why the eye is for seeing. Namely, those organisms that had proto-eyes and could see survived and reproduced, and those organisms that did not have, or that had proto-eyes which didn't work, didn't survive and reproduce. And so this is the way it all happened. But notice that this is all naturalistic. It doesn't require God, it's just happening. However, notice that Darwin is not explaining purposes, final causes, teleology away. He's not explaining it away. He accepts final causes. You read The Origin of Species. I mean, for instance, Darwin says, what is the final cause of the cuckoo laying its eggs in other people's nests? And he gives an explanation, namely, the cuckoo lays things on a slow basis, and if it did it in its own nest, it would be it would take all the time of laying, and then for the cuckoo, it would be time to go south, and so it wouldn't fit in. So what it does is it lays its eggs in other people's nests, and then can clear off, and they can raise them while the cuckoo's having fun down in Africa. So that's the final cause. That's the point. So as I say, Darwin is a teleologist. He believes in final cause, but he's working it all out in the mechanistic world. Now, a lot of people, even if they weren't religious, found this very difficult to accept. How could this possibly be like that? And so what you get is people going back to the organic picture. And in fact, there was a big growth of this in Germany at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. And probably the major figure that we know of in this context is Goethe, the great poet. Goethe was, as it were, what they call a leader of the Romantic philosophy, if you like. And Romanticism was very much organicism. In other words, Romanticism saw the world as developing, and the development comes from within rather than from without. So you see, for Darwin, why does the oak grow into the oak tree? Why does the acorn go into the oak tree? Well, because in the past, those acorns which developed in the direction of being oak trees, as opposed to developing in the direction, let's say, of being cabbages, survived and reproduced, and the cabbages didn't. So, as it were, for Darwin, it's all, but it's something which happens from outside. Why does the acorn develop into the oak? It doesn't need it now, but in the past, it had to have, as it were, forces from outside which developed it and sent it that way. Whereas the organicist says, oh no, right from the start, organisms are self-directing. The forces that direct them come from within. And also, what's really important is for the Darwinian, for the mechanist, there's no value, which means there cannot be any progress. Now, Darwin wrestled with this. I mean, and sometimes he does. I mean, Darwin clearly, thought there was not only progress, but it led up to Englishmen. No question about that, which of course is true. But as I say, Darwin didn't want this in his science. And if you look what he says as he works it out through the years, he writes to people who are progressionists and says, I've come to the decision that there is no absolute progress like this. So here we've got then Darwin is the forces that drive things forward are external, which fits in with being mechanistic, and there's no progress and there's no value, which of course also fits in the mechanistic picture. But there were still, as I say, there were romantics in Germany, and they became quite influential in England, first of all through Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wasn't, he read Goethe, but the philosopher that he really read, that was really all powerful, was a man called Friedrich Schelling. And Schelling was the one that actually Coleridge cribbed and didn't, I mean, he ought to have been president of Harvard. But as I say, he cribbed it. And then Herbert Spencer, who was a rather eclectic figure, about 10 years younger than Darwin, he picked up on this and he became an enthusiastic organicist, very much, as it were, opposed to Darwin. But interesting, you get the class things too. Darwin is very much upper class. His grandfather and his wife's grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood, the potter. So Darwin was literally Silicon Valley rich. I mean, he really was incredibly rich. Whereas Herbert Spencer he was middle class, but very much lower middle class. So he looked at things from a different perspective. He didn't look at things as it were being given to us in some easy sort of way. So Herbert Spencer saw the world as something where you've got to work, you've got to put effort into it. But if you do this, then things will develop and things will get better. Now, the interesting thing is, how does this happen? And this brings in the other great philosopher, evolutionist, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, the Frenchman, who put forward a theory of evolution at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. Now, Lamarck did not have anything to do with natural selection. For Lamarck, it's what we call Lamarckism today, inheritance acquired characteristic. In other words, I'm the blacksmith, I work at it like this, and my kids are going to be born with bigger, stronger muscles, that sort of thing. Now, Darwin had this as a secondary mechanism, but it was always secondary. Whereas for Herbert Spencer, this was the primary mechanism, and that, of course, happens internally. Then, as it were, I'm faced with things, and so I do things. But I'm doing things, as it were. The force of what's happening is not because I'm winning and you're getting wiped out because you're a wimp or something like that. It's because of the things which are within me, helping me to develop. So, in other words, for Herbert Spencer, Lamarckism is an internal thing, and Spencer, unlike Darwin, is absolutely fanatical about progress, and he sees things progressing up, and he's quite explicit that it's Englishman at the end, because one of the things he says, you see progress everywhere, and we see progress in languages, and there's no question that the English language is far more sophisticated than any other language, which of course went down well because everybody in England knew that God spoke in the language of the King James Bible. So that was almost a priori true. And so here we've got these two opposing positions. And you must understand that Spencer was incredibly popular. He didn't even pretend to be a regular scientist. I mean, like somebody like Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley. He was, as it were, a general writer, but his whole world vision, as it were, was incredibly attractive. And this, of course, got combined with what are known as social Darwinism, where the idea is the only way we can get better is through developing things. And that means we have to have a struggle in society. But that's good because the winners will be better than the losers. And so we get progress. And the person who's best known for being a social Darwinian, of course, is Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish-born owner of United Steel in Pittsburgh, and very successful. But the interesting thing about these people is they weren't just, as it were, they had a philosophical basis for what they were doing. They were not just doing it out of selfishness. And of course, as we know, no sooner had Carnegie made these huge amounts of money, which involved some pretty tough things. The Homestead strike is awful. But as soon as he got the money, what did he do? He gave it away. And how did he give it away? He founded public libraries. I don't know about you, audience, but when I was a kid in 1950, I lived in Walsall, just outside Birmingham, And one of the places I would go to at least twice a week was the Carnegie Library. It was there for us all to use. So in other words, it wasn't they weren't just simply, as it were, out to nature read in tooth and claw. They really did care about these things. Because the whole underlying philosophy was that of progress. And if all you're doing is looking after yourself and making lots of money for yourself and bugger the rest of the world, that's not progress. That's not progress. What you've got to do is use this system so that when you, as it were, start to accumulate the money, you can do something to feed back into society. But it sounds very much like Margaret Thatcher. And well, at least let's put it another way. Margaret Thatcher sounds very much like Herbert Spencer. So you know that Margaret Thatcher didn't like welfare, but she would say, and I think she was genuine in this, I don't like welfare because it means that people are lazy buggers who sit on their butts like philosophy students and don't do anything. What we've got to do is pull away that sort of thing, so they have to get up in the morning, wash, and go to work. And so this is the kind of philosophy that somebody like Margaret Thatcher inherited from the tradition of Spencer. So here we then have these two opposing views about evolution in the second half of the 19th century. Everybody's an evolutionist. The question is, what drives it? Is it mechanism or is it some kind of organic growth? And so this takes us into the 20th century. Next, please. And what we see, I'm just skipping, but what we see is by the 1930s, evolution now has got genetics, and genetics is blended into the whole system. And I'm showing you two of the major figures who were, as it were, the founders of what is known as the synthetic theory of evolution in America and neo-Darwinism in England. And on the left-hand side, what we've got is Ronald Fisher, who was a brilliant mathematician, but also the leading theoretical evolutionist of the first half of the 19th century. And Fisher devised a whole system which showed how natural selection could, in fact, develop things. He didn't have progress in his system. However, Fisher was a keen eugenicist. So Fisher was not against progress, but he thought if we're going to have progress, that has to come from a different source, namely us. In other words, Fisher was quite happy to have us as the best, and even happier to have the English as the best of the best. But it didn't come through natural selection. It came through our designing and, as it were, breeding that sort of way. And Fisher, for instance, wanted to have family allowances, but not for everybody, not for the poor. Fisher wanted family allowances for the middle classes, so they would have children and they would raise, as it were, raise things up. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the American equivalent, and this is Sewell Wright, who went to work at the University of Chicago and worked there for 40 years. And Sewell Wright is, as I say, the other major founder of modern evolutionary theory. However, Sewell Wright, if you look at his picture, it's not Darwinian. It's very different from Fisher. Fisher sees change occurring through natural selection. And Fisher sees the world, as it were, the fitness world, as being a bit like a waterbed. As one side, as it were, starts to do better and better, it pushes down and pushes the others up. And so there's never any, as it were, fixed upper level, lower level. It's all, as it were, going up and down like that. Now, Sewell Wright had a different picture. He saw, as it were, the fitness world, and what he called his adaptive landscape. He saw it as fixed, with peaks like this. And so Sewell Wright was a progressionist, and he wanted to know how organisms could progress. Here you are on a lower peak, there's a higher peak. Maybe, let's say, adaptation. Let's say, you're all beige or something like that. But those up at the top are bright brown. They're better. So the question is, how then do you evolve from beige to brown? You can't just go right up, because you've got peaks. You've got a lower peak to get through. No, sorry, a valley to get through to get on. But that's not as fit as where you are. So in other words, you've got to do something non-Darwinian in order to make things move. And of course, as we know from Saul Wright, this is his idea of genetic drift, that in smaller populations, and he thought organisms are split into smaller populations, then, as it were, natural, non-directed forces can be effective and they can alter things around. And so what Saul Wright saw is things at a lower peak, genetic drift takes them down into the valley, and then they can climb up the upper peak and you get progress. What? This is not Darwinian. What is it? Spencerian. Now you might say, goodness me, are you telling me that American evolutionary biology is Spencerian? Well, the answer is yes, because Saul Wright was a student at the University of Chicago at Harvard in the 1910s. And we know that Harvard biology at that time was very, very strongly Spencerian. The person who was most effective at this was L.J. Henderson. And Henderson was an out-and-out Spencerian. And Saul Wright took classes from him. And we've got letters that Saul Wright wrote to his brother, Quincy Wright, who was a political scientist working on things like war and that sort of thing. And Saul Wright writes to his brother and says, oh my goodness, Henderson is so inspiring. And he says, this is, we get peaks and then we get declines, and it's all very Spencerian. So, as I say, we've got this balance in evolutionary biology in the 1930s. They didn't call it that, but that was what was going on. And one particularly interesting case is Theodosius Dobzhansky, the Russian-born population geneticist. And Theodosius Dobzhansky wrote the classic, Genetics and the Origin of Species. And if you look at the first edition of 1937, it's very Spencerian, very Saul Wright Spencerian. The final edition of 1851 has switched entirely. It's Darwinian, Fisher, and all of these things. And so this leads us up then into the second half of the 20th century. We're getting up to our time now. Next, please. Who are the dominant sorts of figures who are, next please, are the figures that are giving us this sort of picture? Sorry, can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, there we are. So on the one hand, we've got the machine metaphor people, and that, of course, what I'm showing you is Bill Hamilton, who did that brilliant work on Hymenoptera, showing how Hymenopteran fitness doesn't go against natural selection, doesn't require group selection, but it's all, as it were, a question of passing on your genes. Incidentally, he's building on ideas which are in the Origin of Species. So on the one hand, you've got the machine metaphor people, and next please. And on the other hand, you've got the organic metaphor people. Next please. And here we are, Stephen Jay Gould, who what I'm showing you is a spandrel, and he's the author of the famous, notorious paper, The Spandrels of San Marco, that he co-authored with Dick Lewontin in 1979, and he is out and out an organicist. For him, natural selection is a very minor effect. That it's much more a question of homologies, bioplanar, and entirely an organic sort of position. So what we've got, right up to leading to the present day, is we've got this tension between, as I say, organicists and mechanists. So in some way, what I'm saying is the new biology is not that bloody new. It's been going on. I mean, I'm not putting it down. I'm not saying, as I say, for me now, as somebody who's interested in history as well as the philosophy, it turns out to be a huge amount more interesting than I thought it would be. So understand, I'm not trivializing it or anything like that. What I am saying is the new biology is not something that someone in Scotland or wherever he is, Leyland or wherever it is, have thought up in 2003, and suddenly, oh my God, we've got a new paradigm, blah blah blah. This has been going on for a very, very long time. I'm almost finished. So here we've got then the two positions, and this leads us on to the next please. And this leads us on to the present. And what we've got then is, here's an example of showing you how it works. Cave fish tend to be blind. And that's a good adaptive reason, because if their eyes are working, they're going to get detritus in them, and that's not going to be a good thing. They're going to be festering with sores. So when they get into, what we see is that cave fish get into caves, they turn blind. Now, is this Lamarckian, as it were, use and non-use? Those who don't use their eyes, as it were, flipping it the other way, are going to survive and reproduce, and those who don't are. But the motive force, is going to come from within, which is the extended evolutionary synthesis, which is the organicist position, as opposed to the Darwinians, standard evolutionary theory people. That Darwin, that's Lamarck, by the way, on the left, on the right, Darwin on the left. And what somebody like Jerry Coyne says is no, it's all natural selection. We've got genes to make eyes or non-eyes, but then there are other genes which attach themselves to the genes making eyes or non-eyes and alter the speed or the way, the efficiency of how they can work. And so, in other words, you don't need Lamarckian things. It's all something driven by natural selection. And so, as I say, and I'm coming to an end now, this is where we're at. Now, move along, please. Next, please. What's interesting for me as a philosopher is that this isn't just a question of science. Next, please. It isn't just a question of science, but we see that it goes into areas of technology and particularly into Mother Nature. And on the left-hand side, I'm showing you Vandana Shiva, the Indian woman, who incidentally was one of my students many years ago. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing you normal rice and then yellow rice. And of course, yellow rice is a GM food, and it's got minerals in it which make up for vitamin A, which a lot of people in the third world suffer from, vitamin A deficiencies. And so we've got the battle goes on. The GM people say, yeah, it's all mechanism. This is the way that it should do. Somebody like Vandana Shiva says, oh no, but you're not looking at the whole picture. So what you're doing is, if you're just growing with genetic foods, then this is going to mean it's going to be bad for the land. It's going to be bad for the animals there. It's going to, as it were, what is it? Something spring. And so what's going on there is it's not a good thing that people who are growing a diversity of various vegetables and things which could provide vitamin A are just being wiped out. And so this is a bad thing. So as I say, we've got really tough arguments going on here in the real world, because India bans yellow rice. And as you know, I mean, I taught at Guelph, the Aggie College, which had an Aggie College, and they had a hell of a lot of trouble. They would develop these, animals and plants which didn't need or could do, and then they couldn't get anywhere with them because of all the opposition from the Vandana Shivas of the world. Okay, and finally, it also extends, next please, it also extends, interestingly, into religion, because on the one hand, you've got on the left-hand side, you've got the traditional vision of the Christian God as all-powerful, or unchanging, eternal, all of these things. In other words, Platonic, as it were, doesn't change. So at some level, God is incapable of feeling pity, because to feel pity would mean at some level he'd have to change. He'd have to react. If he saw a child in trouble, pity means he would have to, and God being impassible is the phrase, can't do this. Whereas process theology, which owes its thing to A.N. Whitehead, says, oh no, God is much more organic. He changes, he develops, and he is progressive in some sense. And what I'm showing you, of course, is Anne Frank, who not only wrote a diary, and then died in Bergen-Belsen of cholera. And the process theologian says, there's Anne Frank dying, hot, fevered, in pain, and God is with her. But also, of course, Anne Frank's diary was found and published, and a huge influence. I mean, I've got 5 kids, and I know how important Anne Frank's diary was for them. And the process theologian says, yes, that's God too. So God is not just sitting on his bum, as it were, waiting for things to happen. He's there, involved in the way that the world is, the tragedy, but also trying to conquer the tragedy, as it were, as Anne Frank's diary so clearly does. And that, folks, next please, is the end of my talk.
Thank you, Michael. That was wonderful. A magnificent tour of world thought on this area, from Plato to Anne Frank. It's fantastic. A lot to think about. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask for people to raise questions by raising their hand. The raise hand icon is at the top right of center of the page. Marian, please come in.
I'm not so sure, Michael, that the new biology is I mean, a lot of people doing Evo, Devo, Eco are looking for a mechanistic explanation to include development as well as ecology into evolutionary biology. So a lot of those, now some of them, there may be others who are talking about things like agency, and I think they do fit into your other category. Do you know what I mean? So I'm not sure that all the new biology in terms of Evo, Devo, and Eco is necessarily the other side.
Your point is well taken. Obviously, a regular biologist, a mechanistic biologist, is not going to ignore development. As we know, in the 1930s, development was more or less put on one side as too complex. So one tended to think of organisms like sausage machines, genes in, as it were, phenotypes out. But then, of course, as it were, as molecular biology was developed, the 1970s or so, there became much more interest, as you say, in how did the development actually occur. I see no reason, I mean, certainly true, that a lot of perfectly mechanistic biologists welcomed this and jumped right in. However, there's no question but that a lot of the people who are drawn to organicism want to say Evo Devo, I mean, Steve Gould was one, want to say that Evo Devo shows us that it's not just mechanical, that it's somehow things happen and it's at some level self-developing within the system. And that's what they make it be. No, I'm not, no, as I said, I'm not denying that regular biologists are going to turn their back on it or not be keen on Evo Devo. But as you know, or certainly as you should know, I'm sure you do know, that the people who are new biologists are very, very keen on Evo Devo because they want to claim that this shows that it's not just natural selection, but it's things that happen within and self-development which lead monad to man.
Can I ask one more question, Jeff?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Michael, I was wondering what you think of, because I don't think it was mentioned in your book unless I missed it. I read the whole thing. About the Hall-Giesland distinction between individuals and classes. That is, that all of evolutionary theory can be divided into 2 big schools of thought, so to speak. The one, the population geneticists, the synthetic theory, the mechanists, and on the other side, systematics or taxonomy. And systematics insists, and the first kind produces laws, not unlike, say, the relative frequency of alternative alleles not changing in a population unless they're acted on by a force. It's just like Newton's first law of motion. But over on the other side, the systemists or taxonomists, who classify organisms into groups within groups, revealing their historical affinities, those things are historically specific individuals. So a species or a higher taxon has a specific origin, a specific spatial distribution, and a specific end. That is, it's an individual, but not an organically, not a functionally integrated individual like an organism, but it's an individual in the sense that only specific statements can be made about it, as opposed to over here with population genetics, which makes these law-like statements. It's not an organic view, but it does kind of draw the two into two different kind of, and they both made that point independently. I was wondering what you thought about it.
Well, obviously, Claydism doesn't use Darwinian theory to, to get what it wants. And Darwin himself is quite open about this, because if you look at the origin, it's a very peculiar book, because Darwin is not a Darwinian when it comes to things happening. All of his examples in the third chapter, is it the fourth chapter, of wolves and that, they're all pretend examples. Darwin never gives us real examples, because what did what kind of biologist was he? He was a taxonomist working on those damn barnacles for 8 years. So the answer to your question is, I certainly see that there's going to be a difference, let's say over classification, between somebody like Ernst Mayr or Simpson, who are synthetic theorists who saw organisms as classes in Darwinian terms, and the more modern people who see it, the cladists, who see it in not non-evolutionary terms. They're ardent evolutionists, but of course, as we know, where does cladism come from? Hennig. And where is Hennig? Hennig is not, downtown Birmingham. Hennig's in Germany. So I see. I know. I certainly. I give you. I think that's a very good point you're making, and I think it would be one which merits a book. I think, Marion, you've got your work cut out for the next 5 years, writing a book showing us just this. I'm 83. I don't have to do any more now. But you think about it. No, seriously, I think your point is well taken. I'm not. You see, the whole point. As I say, I've mellowed when I set out. When I set out, I was just an ardent mechanist, and I thought anybody who had any organic position or thinking was just plain wrong, and probably related to either my father or my headmaster, both of whom were ardent organicists. So I had, as it were, good Oedipal reasons to be a mechanist. But I've mellowed over that now. I can see that these are alternative ways of looking at things. And I'm sufficiently Kuhnian to think that these are not necessarily contradictory, but they're different ways of rather like religions, politics, and those things. Doesn't mean to say I'm an ardent, living down here, I'm an ardent Democrat as opposed to a Trumpian. So it doesn't mean to say we can't make any distinctions that way. But it's very clear. I think this is a good example that people are not just driven by reason, as it were, that there's a lot to do with emotional commitment and those sorts of things. And I would be perfectly happy to say that could well be the case in biology. I'm not convinced that organicism is that helpful when you're doing things like DNA work. But when it comes to evo-devo or development, as long as you're very careful, I'm not saying that you don't have to look at the holes in some sort of way. What I'm trying to avoid, though, is sort of elan vital along the idea of people like Bergson, that there's, hidden Aristotelian forces which are driving things. I'm not a fan of that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Can I ask a question? There's nobody else in the queue, Michael, but I've got lots of questions, and I'll start with one. I'm a bit unsure about your fundamental division here between mechanism and organicism. I'm familiar with much or most of what you say, but what's the key issue here? And I'm thinking particularly of people like Spencer. Is the key issue the admission of teleology or purpose into one's scheme? In other words, an Aristotelian final cause argument. Or is organicism more about relations and structures as well as elements? Okay, there's a constant complaint which I share about tendencies in some sciences, including economics and including biology, to focus on units and see those as a be all and end all of the explanation. So we get what you might call genetic determinism or genetic reductionism in various versions. I'm speaking very, yeah, that's a tendency. Similar thing in economics. Economists think they can model the world by assuming individuals with utility functions. Now, so what's the crucial issue? Is it both those things, structure, organism, final cause, or is it one of those?
I think it's a bit of both, isn't it? I mean, if mechanism means that you eliminate talk about purposes. I know Michael Giesland has said this on at times, that Darwin just eliminates teleology from biology. And I think he's just plain wrong there, because if you look at the Origin of Species, there's more teleology in that book than on the habits of animals, on the nature of animals in Aristotle. I mean, Darwin's final cause all the way. The question is, though, where do those final causes come from? And he is very much out. He is very much not of. I mean, of course, Bergson came after Darwin, but he's very much not a Bergsonian. Who Bergson, of course, was in fact a Spencerian. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that Darwin isn't a teleologist. Now, you might want to say, I'm sure that some of the new biologists would say, oh yes, but Darwin doesn't really capture the whole aspect of what it means to be purposeful or something like that. Well, that's like blind cave fish. That's where I think the expert scientists get involved. I mean, as a philosopher, I think it's very interesting. But what I want to see is, what do you people, as scientists, come up with? Can somebody like Jerry Coyne always make a plausible response to that even Jablonka and others like that want to push forward? So, as I say, I look upon this as, at some level, an empirical matter, although, my own feeling is that probably the Uvo Devo people aren't going to get quite as far as they hope they will.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just push a bit further on that? There's a difference between admitting a separate category of causality in an Aristotelian fashion, final causes versus other causes. Okay, difference between that and what Darwin might be doing, in my interpretation, which is really emphasizing, contrary to some of the people who follow him, really emphasizing the importance of purpose. And as I've read The Origin, and I agree with you, it goes through the book. I mean, animals have a sense of purpose. They're concerned, and also in The Descent of Man, they're concerned about explaining human evolution, but he's silent about that in The Origin. But he's kind of preparing the ground by looking at issues of deliberation, conscious thought, semi-conscious thought, feelings in lower, so-called lower animals. Okay, and so
I think that's a very good point.
but that's different from believing in a separate category of causality, right? So ultimately, I mean, this is, as you and I know, this is a very complicated issue, and I think we have to separate the two things. One is the attempt to explain final causes by mechanical causes, which Darwin does, I think, in a very sophisticated way for his knowledge at the time, for what we knew at the time, and saying there's another category. This is Bergson. Bergson is fundamentally different. With Spencer, it's a different story. With Spencer, really, I don't think he really pins this down. He doesn't, from my reading of some of his work, the amount of work he's produced is enormous. My reading of the basic Spencerian texts is that basically he assumes a process, a nature of evolution, this creation of complexity, without bothering about whether there's purpose or explanation. It's basically a law which he plucks from somewhere, the mark inspiring him and so on, and posits that as a basic evolutionary principle, which is not quite the same thing as believing in purpose. It ends up with a purposeful teleology in it, and that's why Spencer eventually was heavily criticised in the 20th century.
Well, yes, but don't forget, everything Spencer does is against his background of progress. So, I mean, there's purpose, final cause in everything that Spencer writes. I mean, this is the thing. And Spencer never wrestles with this because he's just committed to this. I think, I think
Okay.
Darwin's more interesting because clearly, as a human being, as a person, as an Englishman, Darwin sees progress. There's no question but that the English are superior to others. I mean, if you look at his writings,
Yeah, no doubt about that. I agree.
what he says about foreigners
Yeah.
sometimes makes makes your hair stand on end.
Yes, I agree.
It really does. I mean,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
you've got hair to have stand on end, but you know what I mean. Anyhow, no. So I'm not denying that. So I think the whole point about the organicists is at some level they do see purpose. But don't forget, I'm rather poo-pooing the idea that there's evolution or purpose up to human beings. A lot of very eminent biologists in the last 50 years have committed. I mean, you read, read sociobiology, the modern synthesis, and it's progressive all the way through. I mean, he talks about these 4 peaks of evolution, and then the abiding mystery is how humans have scaled above any of the others. And it goes on and on and on about that sort of thing. And then he gets back to it in his book on human nature. So, as I say, I mean, I'm not denying any of that, but I'm saying that I still think there's 2 approaches to this. One, it's a difficult thing, isn't it, Ryan? Because, Jeff, because at one level, you and I obviously think that we're superior to, what shall I say, to warthogs, or at least I happen to think I'm superior to warthogs. I'll let you decide for yourself. But at the same time, the question is, does our biology show this? Or is this in some sense, an existential commitment that we make as human beings to this? That we have, I mean, I happen to value having sex with human females rather than warthog females. I won't speak to others, but you see what I mean. So it's a question of to what extent do these beliefs come in objectively, which they do for a Christian, and to what extent are they, as it were, imposed? Sometimes I call myself, and this is pretentious bullshit, I call myself a Darwinian existentialist because I want to say I'm a Darwinian, but I think you have to make these commitments.
Thanks for that. That's very stimulating. Fanish, would you like to come in now with your question?
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Michael. Wonderful talk. I'm not a biologist, but I study human organizations. I did have a question I wanted to get clarification on and then a comment as well. So the question is, it sounds to me like the people you characterize as organicism, is that the right word? They're also interested in mechanistic explanation, but the scope of the systems they are interested in are larger. So they draw the boundaries at a larger scope. And that might create conflicts between people who take a narrower scope approach to explanation. So in thinking about systems, you can think about small systems and large ones. And in smaller systems, you obviously ignore interactions with the surrounding context to a greater degree. Is that really one of the fundamental problems that separates these 2 ways of thinking?
Now, what are you saying exactly? That there's 2 ways of looking at problems. One which is kind of reductionistic, where you just look at things right down there, and the other is more organic, where you try to take broader considerations into.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying both approaches are fundamentally reductionist in the sense they care about underlying mechanism, but the scope of the system that they're targeting for explanation could vary.
Well, yes, but I'd want to see how are you going to spell that out? I mean, let's take Nazi Germany. I mean, at the one level, there's an awful lot of stuff which has been written about Germans and their, acceptance of authority and all of those sorts of things, which I take to be more of an internal thing. But then, of course, Nazi Germany came about because of the loss of Germany in the First World War and the Versailles Treaty. So that seems to me to be more of an external thing. Now, I'm a little uneasy about wanting to say either or but not both. I mean, I could well imagine if you're going to write a book, for God's sakes, one of the problems, as we all know, when we're dealing with students doing their PhD theses, is for God's sakes, narrow it down, narrow it down, narrow it down. I mean, no, seriously. I mean, that's one of the things we're always saying to them. Look, you can't write the whole critique of pure reason in 200 pages. You can't. So, as I say, I'm not against somebody saying, I'm going to focus on the internal German psychology, which led to this. But I think any reasonable person wants to say that's just part of the story. So this is why I am, as I say, in certain respects, more ecumenical than I would have been earlier. I mean, I'm no longer a believer. I was brought up as a Quaker, lost my faith about the age of 20, and I thought at 70, becoming back, you can't make too many mistakes at that age, but it hasn't. So at one level, I don't have any of this. But I must say, were I a believer, I would find process theology very attractive. Which I've got a lot of friends who, I mean, I go off once a year to Religion and Age of Science, who are all UUs or UCC, and they're all into process theology, and I can very much understand why. I find that kind of God way more attractive than a God of Augustine, who's a Platonic form, and that's it. So I'm not against these things, but particularly in the science, I want to see. I'd like to see more actual science, which is actually working. I mean, I think the blind cavefish is a good example. Now, if you want to say to me, "Oh, yes, but that's one of many," well, let's have a look at the many. As I say, again, I don't pretend to be a biologist. I would turn to Jerry Coyne and say, Jerry, help me here. But anyhow, that's what I'm saying.
And the quick comment as a follow-on is, I actually found your comments very illuminating to think about the current discussion about the kinds of things that artificial intelligence can do, particularly in the domain of creativity, because there's a very similar discourse right now between the kinds of things that algorithms can mechanistically produce, which still passes for creativity, versus the kind of creative outcomes that humans produce. And the same sort of tension is at work where people say it can be all reduced and explained down to the functioning of the equivalents of neurons in these algorithms. And there are others who argue there is some Elan Vital equivalent which we are missing. So it's kind of a very contemporary problem as well, the one you're flagging.
I taught philosophy for 55 years. It's hard to believe that when I quit at the age of 80, 3 years ago, I was very reluctant. I really felt, but now artificial intelligence has come along and the whole problem of plagiarism, I'm not entirely sorry that I'm retired, and it's your problem, not mine.
Thank you.
Anybody else like to raise a question? Michael, I've got a question for you. I mean, it may be a bit provocative, but it's your area. You're well known for your discussion. You've hinted on this several times of the relationship between biological science and religion. Okay, so what's I'm going to agree with you. I'm not going to disagree, but I'd be interested, and I think others would. Can you give a snapshot of your critique of Dawkins on this, please?
Well, son of a bitch, if you read The God Delusion, he calls me Neville Chamberlain. So, no,
Sorry, you can avoid it if you want, but
yeah, I'm torn between what he's saying and my general philosophy. I don't mind what you say, so long as you spell my name correctly. But no, I mean, more seriously, if I mean, obviously, I'm not against somebody taking Dawkins' position. I mean, I think a lot of very intelligent people, Bertrand Russell, have taken that. On the other hand, if you're going to do that, I like to see it at least backed by some kinds of plausible arguments, rather than sneering comments about, if an argument's stupid, you can be damn sure that that's going to attract philosophers. Well, I'm allowed to say that, but I don't think he's allowed to say that. I mean, he sneers at the ontological argument. Now, I don't know how many philosophers actually accept the ontological argument, but I've never met a philosopher who hasn't thought the ontological argument is really interesting. How can you get so much from so little?
That's
So
right.
that's where I get pissed off with Dawkins. It's the same. If I said, oh, well, genes can't be selfish, that's just bullshit, move on, let's get on to real science, I would say, you know, that's you, that's not right. You don't understand. I mean, I think the selfish gene is a brilliant metaphor, brilliant, whether you accept it or not. And I, it's just dismissing these things that way. No, as I say, what, as it were, makes me even more cross is that I think Dawkins does raise some very interesting questions, but sneering about them is not the way to do it. I think the whole question of religious indoctrination of young people, I think that's I mean, I live in the American South where these kids, they push this creationism at kids, and don't kid yourself that schools in the South are not teaching creationism, because they bloody are. We know that. I mean, the chap who's now, you know, on chair of the House of Representatives, third in line to the presidency, and he spent, you know, half his career making sure that public school children learn creationism. So I'm not against what Dawkins says. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, the extent to which parents have the right to teach their kids whatever they believe. I mean, if I heard that you went home and put on your jackboots and your Nazi jacket and then got your kids lined up and said, see, Kyle, I'm Volk, I'm Reich, I'm Führer, I'd be a little worried about that.
Quite rightly,
And
yes.
so, as I say, I think Dawkins raises a lot of very interesting questions. And obviously, his rhetoric is very successful. I mean, you know, I wish I'd got the kind of royalties he's making. But
Yeah.
at the same time, it's shallow, and it's shallow. That's what worries me.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you look at a great philosopher like Descartes. I mean, I don't think Descartes' argument, the existence of God in the Meditations, works, but I'm just left speechless at the acumen, the intellect, which is working on that. Anyhow, there you go.
No, that's great. Thanks a lot. Before we wrap up then, are there any further questions? Robin.
Hi. Just trying to get my.
Yeah, there you are.
you are. Good. Hello, Michael. Good to see you
Hi
in
there.
fine fettle. I was just amused about your comment, actually, on Dawkins having been described by the erstwhile Bishop of Oxford as the acceptable face of Richard Dawkins on the subject of biology and religion. But anyway, what I was going to ask about really was the Evo-Devo component, and it seemed to me that what the Devo bit is all about really is constraints, ultimately. And this is, I mean, there is a certain conflation of levels of explanation a little bit, I think, in that, you know, okay, yes, you have to have mechanisms that produce the effects ultimately, and these are effectively the costs of selection. They're the pressure selection is having to push against, and they can limit inevitably what you can do. Nick Davis's famous remark as to why butterflies don't carry machine guns. There is a limitation on what you can do when you're small and airborne, or didn't evolve machine guns. And that in some sense, it's a kind of trivial claim, really, because those sort of mechanisms components have to be there, but it's sort of in danger of pushing us into conflating Timberg and Wise mechanisms and function. and that isn't necessarily all that helpful. And I'm not sure they count as kind of organicists in that sense. I tend to see them as just pushing a line to try and get some PR out there rather than being substantive kind of change in the structure of evolutionary arguments, as it were, because the Devo bit has always been there. It's just that we kind of didn't know that much about them, really.
So go on. Is there a question?
Well, and it's just a comment really on where you ended up with the Evo Devo folk, which I kind of took you to be putting them up as a sort of example of contemporary organicism, really, rather than strict Darwinian functionalists.
Look, if I were a regular scientist, I would be very attracted to working on Evo Devo. Particularly the alternative is looking at groundhogs getting up at 4 in the morning, in northern Ontario to see what they're doing. I've seen people do that, and that's not my way of living. On the other hand, I've discovered basically I don't like doing physical things like that. When I did A-level physics, I used to get the other guy to do the physics, and I'd write it up. Then I draw a line, and I put the lines there, and then I put a cross up there, which is one which didn't fit in. So that's my way of doing science, I'm afraid. Just as well I'm a philosopher, not that. But I seriously, I think Evo Devo is terrifically exciting. Really exciting. And I mean, it's the next frontier, isn't it? Because
yes, it's introducing a new dimension. I have to agree, it's exciting because I do think the sort of selection arguments and the ecological based functional arguments are running out of steam a little bit because so much has been done. It's hard to find anything new. But having done the opposite transition to you and started as a philosopher and discovered very early on you have to have a brain the size of a planet to actually do it well. I bailed out and became a field biologist, you see, and went off studying the marmots in the mountains. So I have that intrinsic, that sort of emotional commitment to the field work.
the worst mistake I ever made was getting a distinction at A-level math, which convinced me that I was good enough to go to university and read mathematics. My second day there, I realized I was a good high school mathematician, but I was not a real mathematician at all. Finally, I managed to find an escape doing philosophy, but we all have to, as it were, learn what our interests and what our abilities are, and they're not always obvious as we're growing up.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, it reminds me, Michael, of that saying, I have to look up who said it, is that treats philosophy as that bourne from which no traveller returns. I forgot who said it, but I think it's a great amendment on Shakespeare. And I've got a history studying philosophy too, so I can speak for that. But it's not a bad place to spend your life. Thank you very much indeed for a wonderfully stimulating talk. It's great to see you. Keep well, and we've enjoyed your work and we've enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much on behalf of everybody here.
Thank you for having me. And the thing is, more than anything, I've been having terrific fun. Really, really great fun. And I think that if research, I mean, yeah, there's always marking papers. Anybody who says marking papers is fun is a bloody liar. But let's put this up to it. If your work, both teaching and research at some level, is not fun, then you're a very unhappy person. I've had a lovely time, folks. Thanks a lot.
Right, I'm very pleased about that. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.